Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be my long-awaited fountain pens beginners slash starter guide video. I've been using fountain pens since I was 16. I'm currently 22, so it's been quite a few years, and I share my love for fountain pens on this channel quite a bit, and I've gotten so many requests over the years to make a starter guide, and I just never got around to it, so I'm very excited. Now, fountain pens have a pretty rich history spanning several centuries, I would say, but it's probably become more of a serious hobby in the past 2 decades or so. I'm actually not sure. There's a lot of caveats and information to consider, and with any hobby there are just a lot of strong opinions. This video is just going to be aimed at the complete beginner. I'm just going to scratch the surface of exactly what you need to know to get started and nothing more than that. So let's get started. These are the little topics that I will be covering, and we're going to start with the introduction. So what are fountain pens? Fountain pens are a writing utensil. That is simply what it is. These are just some of the parts of a fountain pen. There are a lot more details that I didn't include, but these are just some of the terminology that you might encounter. But really what you need to know is that with a fountain pen, there is this barrel, and in the barrel, in some form, there is an ink reservoir. So that is where the ink is stored. You can go on Wikipedia to see the exact mechanics of how ink flows from the reservoir to the paper. But essentially, ink is fed through to the nib, and as the nib touches the paper, it draws a line. And that is really all you need to know. And that wraps up my introduction. So next, I'm going to be talking about ink cartridges versus ink bottles. This is typically what a little box of ink cartridges would look like. Let me take one out. It is a plastic container that is fully filled with ink, and you would stick this into the barrel of a compatible fountain pen, and the ink will flow to the nib. The other route that you can go is using bottles of ink. So I would categorize fountain pens into 2 categories. There's a category of fountain pens that will not accept cartridges and you have to use ink bottles. And then there's another category of pens where you can choose between using ink cartridges or an ink bottle. And I will go more into that in the next section. But anyways, what are the pros and cons of using an ink cartridge? The pros are it is very convenient. You know, you have this fully filled out for you. You don't need to do any twisting action or anything like that. You just stick it into your pen. It is also portable. As you can see, it's just a little box of ink, and you can just carry this around with you when you're traveling. As long as you keep one on hand, you don't really run the risk of accidentally running out of ink while you're out and about. The ink cartridges are fully filled each time. Unlike filling it yourself, you don't encounter things like air bubbles or half fills or anything like that. Some of the cons of using ink cartridges is that there is a pretty limited selection of colors. Some inks are available both as ink bottles and cartridges, but most of them are only exclusive to ink bottles. So you end up with a lot of just plain black, plain blue, plain red. The good news is that some brands are starting to make ink cartridges with cool colors, so hopefully there are more coming. Another con is compatibility. Some pens only accept ink cartridges made by their own company, so you can't really interchange them. So you do have to be careful about that. Next, I'm going to be talking about using bottled ink. If you do decide to go with this route, you honestly open up yourself to a whole new experience of using fountain pens, because for me, especially as an artist who loves color and different materials, it is just so much fun to experiment with different ink colors and finishes and all of that. So again, one of the pros is that there are just so many ink options when it comes to ink bottles versus ink cartridges. The next pro is that it is economical. Now, I put this in quotation marks because this isn't always true. So this is a Pilot Namiki blue ink cartridge set. If you compare using this with the bottle of Pilot Namiki blue ink, that would be more economical, so it would be cheaper to use a bottle of ink. However, if you compare this with using a $60 bottle of ink that is limited edition or something like that, then this is probably cheaper. Another argument against bottled ink being cheaper is that another argument against this pro is that it's really only cheaper if you actually fully intend to use the bottle of ink. If you just like collect a bunch of different bottles of ink, then it's gonna rack up and you will likely not finish all of the ink in your lifetime to make it worthwhile. So it's not necessarily like a bad thing, but I'm just saying, yeah, this argument of bottled ink being economical, it depends on how you approach it. A personal pro for me is I do find using bottled ink, the lines just come out a lot smoother. I don't know if it's just in my head, but I feel like this is the case. And one more small, very superficial pro is that I think bottles are just so beautiful on my desk, and it makes me very happy to see. Some cons of using bottled ink is that it's not really portable. Most of the ink bottles I own are glass, so it is quite heavy and also prone to breaking, especially if you're, flying. I have flown with my ink collection from Vancouver to Toronto and then from Toronto back to Vancouver, and I had to make sure to like bubble wrap it and put it in Ziploc bags just in case like there's a spill or something. And with using ink bottles, there is a little bit of cleanup. It's honestly like kind of a fun process for me to clean up and do fountain pen maintenance, but I guess you could call it a con if you're just looking for convenience. So next up, I'm going to be talking about filling mechanisms, and this is assuming that you won't be going with ink cartridges. If you go with ink cartridges, you just stick into your pen and you're set to go. If you decide to go with ink bottles, you might be wondering, how do you get the ink from the ink bottle into your fountain pen so you can start writing? So there are several different types of filling mechanisms. The two main types are piston and cartridge converter. There's also the vacuum, squeeze, and eyedropper, which does exist on the market, but I don't see too often in a lot of different brands. So I'm just going to be talking about the piston, which is my personal favorite, and the cartridge converter. So this is one of my many TWSBI fountain pens, and they use a piston filling mechanism. This is unfilled, and I will fill it later on to show you as a demo. But basically, as the name suggests, there is a built-in piston inside. So what you would do is twist the end of the fountain pen, and as you can see, the piston slides all the way down. You dip it into your bottle of ink. You make sure that the nib is submerged inside the ink, and then you twist the end back. And as you can see, the piston will suck up the ink. Some pros of using a piston filling mechanism is that typically there is a larger ink capacity, so that means your pen can hold a greater volume of ink, and that means you can also write for a very, very long period of time before you run out of ink and have to fill it again. Like when I'm studying or taking full pages of notes, I can go 2 weeks or so without needing to refill. So again, the TWSBI uses this piston filling mechanism. Some other pens that use this are the Lamy 2000. Just like the TWSBI, you twist the end piece to fill up your pen. Another one is my Pelikan fountain pen. Again, you twist the end to fill your pen. The other main filling mechanism type is the cartridge converter, and these are two of the pens that have this filling mechanism. This is a Sailor fountain pen. So with this, you typically unscrew the barrel of the pen to reveal the cartridge converter. So this piece actually comes off, but I'm not going to do that or else ink will just splatter everywhere. And this dark bit over here, that is where the ink is stored. So right off the bat, just visually, you can see the difference in the amount of ink that this like piston body versus this cartridge can hold. You might also notice that the cartridge converter greatly resembles the look of the ink cartridge that I showed at the beginning. Now, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I'm gonna guess that it is called a cartridge converter because it converts bottled ink into the form of a cartridge that could be accepted by this pen. So what are the pros and cons of using a cartridge converter? It really depends on how you look at it. With a cartridge converter, again, the ink capacity is rather small, so you do have to refill the pen a lot more frequently. However, this sounds more dramatic than it actually is. Even when I use a cartridge converter, typically this fill of ink lasts about a week, so it's not a big problem. Also, if you're someone who likes to switch out ink colors a lot, it might actually be beneficial to have a smaller reservoir of ink so that you don't have to use up large amounts of ink. A con would be that some converters are not made very well, so it becomes very difficult to get a full fill. There are a lot of tricks and hacks posted that you can use to get a full fill, but if we don't dive into that, then that is just the case that some converters just aren't too great and it's very hard to fill it all the way. The next few sections will be about nibs. So first up, I want to talk about steel versus gold nibs. Now, there are other materials, for example, titanium, but I'm not going to be talking about that because I, again, just want to scratch the surface of what you need to know. So steel nibs are typically the cheaper end of the spectrum. It is what is used in most beginner pens. So I did put $1 sign to represent that it is rather cheap. However, I did make it a range to $3 signs because there are certain expensive fountain pens that go over like $100 but still use steel nib pens, and what you're paying for there is just the design of the pen and not necessarily a better writing experience, if that makes any sense. My favorite example is the Visconti Van Gogh fountain pens. They are beautiful fountain pens, and I have been so tempted to buy one just because I love Van Gogh, but despite its high price tag, it is still using a steel nib pen. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but what I'm just saying is that you're paying for the aesthetic and design of the pen itself and not the actual writing experience. The more expensive material is nibs made from gold, and otherwise known as gold nib pens. Typically, the cheapest one is around $100 and it goes up to hundreds and thousands of dollars. I again want to mention that past a certain point, for example, a $10,000 pen, it's not going to have a noticeable or even any difference in writing experience than a $1,000 pen. You're paying for the artistry and the design of the pen itself and not really a $10,000 worth writing experience. So it's very much a personal thing. You can get a really good gold nib pen like this one for about, I think, $150 or $160, which is still a lot for a pen. This is a luxury hobby, so it just depends on whether it's worth it for you. In terms of writing experience for steel versus gold nib, steel nibs are rather rigid, so it's very hard, whereas with most gold nib pens, it tends to be softer, so there is a little bit of character to the lines that you write down, and it's generally a lot softer and smoother. The first time I ever tried a gold nib pen, I was blown away at how smooth it was. And so for this reason, I definitely recommend that you start with a steel nib pen. Steel nib pens are not bad by any means. In fact, most days I write with the TWSBI over my gold nib pens just because I feel like it, and again, it's not a bad thing. So I would definitely recommend starting with a steel nib, and if you find that you love the fountain pen hobby, it's a really valuable utensil for you, then try a gold nib pen and you will be blown away. I do think, if you have the disposable income to get a gold nib pen right away, that is awesome. However, if you've never written with a fountain pen before, I'm afraid that you might not be able to appreciate just how amazing gold nib pens are without trying a steel nib pen first. That is just my personal opinion though. Now, a very important note, which is why I made this very bold, is that steel versus gold nib pens is not determined visually. What I mean by this is, for example, this is my Sailor fountain pen, and as you can see, the nib is silver. Now, when you think of steel, you probably think of a silvery color, and when you think of gold, you think of a gold color. But in fact, this is a 21 karat gold nib, despite the fact that visually the color is silver. So you cannot tell whether a nib is a gold nib or a steel nib just by looking at the color. This is my TWSBI rose gold. And as you can see, the nib is a rose gold color. This is not made from gold or rose gold. It is a steel nib pen. It is just the fact that the color is rose gold. So yes, I want to make this very clear, especially if you're shopping for your first fountain pen. It is important to look in the description. A lot of gold nib pens just look silver. There is also a very cool type of nib, which I do want to show off. This is again my Pelikan fountain pen. So you can see that it's plated with both gold and silver, and it is so beautiful. But yeah, this is a fully gold nib pen. For section 5, I want to quickly touch on Japanese versus European nibs because you might see this thrown around quite a bit. Now, again, a disclaimer, it is not just Japanese people and the continent of Europe making fountain pens. There are a lot of countries making fountain pens, but this is just generally how the fountain pen community categorizes them. So Japanese pens, I think the most notable ones are Pilot and Sailor. Their nibs tend to be ground a lot finer, whereas with European nibs like Lamy and Pelikan, the nibs tend to be wider. So again, generally, a fine nib in a Japanese pen might be an extra fine in a Western nib. Vice versa, a fine nib in a Western pen might be a medium in a Japanese pen. So that is something that is important to keep in mind, that nib sizes are very unique to the company and it's not standardized across all fountain pens. And so before buying a fountain pen, I really recommend looking online for resources of like the different nib size comparisons. And now that we're speaking about nib sizes, that is section 6, there are several nib sizes to choose from. Generally, there are extra fine, fine, medium, and broad. There are, extra ones like, for example, extra fine or fine medium or stub or architect or oblique, all of this extra stuff. But I would say the main 4 are extra fine, fine, medium, and broad. If you are first switching over from using regular pens to fountain pens, I would definitely recommend just getting a fine. Doesn't matter whether it's a Japanese pen or a European pen or what brand you're getting, just get a fine. This is just from my experience a good place to start. I have never gone wrong with getting a fine fountain pen. Medium and broad pens, they are wonderful for displaying the beauty of ink colors and the ink properties, but I wouldn't really recommend starting with a medium or a broad, especially again if you're used to using just like gel pens, because the lines might be a little bit too thick for you to get used to. However, it might interest you in the future, especially if you get into using cool inks or if you just find that you prefer writing with a thicker nib. And there are also fun grinds like stubs and obliques and architects, which you can... There's currently a truck outside, so give me a second. Okay, so there are a lot of fun nib grinds that you can get, and I'm not going to get into that because for your first fountain pen, you're probably not going to get a random architect grind fountain pen. Just know that there is a whole world of fun nibs out there, especially if you get deeper into the hobby. So next I'm going to be talking about paper, which is just as important. When writing with fountain pens, I would definitely recommend getting fountain pen friendly paper, because with a lot of normal paper, especially like the cheapest kind, like printer paper, there tends to be a lot of feathering and bleed throughs, and also printer paper tends to be very toothy. So if, like, for example, the nib of the fountain pen scratches the paper and the tooth of the printer paper gets stuck inside the nib, it can really damage the nib and how the pen writes. Now, there are like papers that are not labeled as fountain pen friendly, but fountain pens write decently well on them, so it's not like a 100% must. But if you want the full fountain pen experience, then I would definitely recommend looking into fountain pen friendly paper. So there are 2 main types that I recommend. One is Clairefontaine paper. Clairefontaine makes my favorite Rhodia pads. Fountain pens perform super well on this paper, and I use it all the time for school. The next is Tombow river paper, and I drew a little river here. This is what the Hobonichi planners and notebooks famously use, but a lot of other notebook brands also use Tombow River paper, so you're not limited to just the Hobonichi. Tombow River paper has a special coating such that it allows fountain pen ink to really shine through and show off their properties, which I'm going to be talking about ink properties next. It is also characteristically thin and light, but there is no bleeding. I use Clairefontaine and Rhodia paper when it is for things like school, work, and just like a setting where I'm not trying to use like super fun inks and show off all of this like shimmer and all of that. I'm just using a fountain pen because I love it and I need to take some notes, or I'm trying to learn something and I'm just using the fountain pen as is. I prefer to use Tombow River paper when I'm doing something more for myself, like for example, some studying on a topic that I really enjoy, or if I'm doing some daily journaling or stuff like that, then I will use Tombow River paper and really just like soak in how beautiful the ink is performing, and I get to see like the shading in real time, and it's just beautiful. So this is going to be the last informational section about fountain pens, but rather I'm going to be talking about ink properties. There are a lot of different types of ink once again, especially if you get into bottled inks. And this is just going to be really up to your personal preference. You can look for inks that are waterproof. There are inks that are drier or wetter. Basically, wet inks are exactly as it sounds. It's a lot gushier, and dry inks is exactly as it sounds. The flow is a little bit more controlled. There are also shimmery inks, like for example this one. You can see at the bottom there is some shimmer that is set in, and you can like shake the bottle. The shimmer will kind of like distribute. It's kind of hard to see though. There is also shading ink, and this is where I see a lot of new fountain pen users get confused. Shading is a property where the ink pools a bit, for example, at the end of a line, and the color between the pooled ink versus the rest of the line is different. And some people really do not care for nor like this quality. For me personally, I find it to be one of the most beautiful things about fountain pens. So again, just personal preference. There's also sheening inks where when it dries, there's like a pool of what seems to be like a shimmer, and it's typically a different color. There's also like dual shading inks where it's similar to shading, but the shaded area is a different color. I'm sure there are other properties that I missed, but I just wanted to outline that there are so many different properties that you can look for in an ink, and maybe the first one you try isn't your favorite, and this is where I want to mention that you can get ink samples. If you have a friend who is well versed with fountain pen inks, maybe they'll send you some ink samples, but you can also buy ink samples on sellers of fountain pens. It'll come in little bottles like this. Obviously, it's not as economical as buying a full bottle of ink, but it might be worth it for you if you are just testing out what kind of properties you like and appreciate in fountain pen inks. The second to last topic that I want to talk about is the pros and cons of fountain pens and whether it's even worth it for you to look into. So let's start with the pros. Number one is with fountain pens, for me at least, I don't get hand cramps when writing with them because unlike gel pens, you don't need to press down on the paper. The ink just flows out by gravity. So for that reason, I can write for long sessions with fountain pens without getting any hand cramps. Versus gel pens, I can really only write one paragraph before my hands start cramping. The second pro is that it's very customizable. You can, get whatever ink you want. You can get whatever pen you want. You can even mix inks, which you might have to be a little bit careful about that. But yeah, it's very customizable. So the next point I want to make is both a pro and a con depending on how you view it. But basically, fountain pens require some level of care and maintenance. When you switch out the ink colors, you need to fully clean the fountain pen so that the ink colors don't mix together and stuff like that. This could be a con if, you're aiming for convenience. But for me, it is a pro because I just love the process of using fountain pens, cleaning and maintenance. It's just so much fun for me, and it's just a form of self-care. And the fourth pro that I want to mention is an argument that I don't typically quite agree with, but it could apply to your case, and it is that fountain pens are more economical and it produces less waste for the environment. So if you are someone who just buys 1 or 2 fountain pens and you buy 1 or 2 ink bottles and that is all you use, then yes, it is likely going to be economical in the long run. Unless you like completely crack your fountain pen, it's going to last for a very long time and you're not like tossing away plastic pens all the time. However, for me personally, I'm the first one to admit, and also from what I see on social media, if you approach fountain pens as a hobby and you collect many fountain pens, you buy many bottles of ink that you likely will never finish, it is not economical and it is also not great for the environment because, you're not really saving any materials because you're still consuming a lot of stuff. So yes, the economical argument I see quite a bit as a pro for fountain pens, but I do want to put it out there that it really depends on the person. Again, I'm the first to admit that for me, it's not a money saver, and I'm also not doing the environment any good by pursuing this hobby. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is if all of this sounds great to you and you want to look into buying your first fountain pen, which pen should you get? Everyone started with different fountain pens and they will have different opinions. What I always recommend are the TWSBI Eco fountain pens. I think they are just the most beginner-friendly fountain pens. Depending on where you get it from, they range from $30 to $40, which is, expensive for a pen, but I do find this to be the most bang for your buck, especially as a first fountain pen. It has my favorite filling mechanism of a piston filler, so it holds a lot of ink. It is easy to clean. The nib and writing experience is always consistent and reliable. The fine nib is not too fine, but it's not too thick, at least for my writing. They also offer a lot of fun colors to choose from. One thing that I also want to mention is that if you end up not liking it, I do think it's quite easy to sell off your TWSBI Eco because there are always people looking to buy ones secondhand. Another really good beginner fountain pen that I recommend are the Lamy Safaris or Lamy All-Stars. I don't have one to show you, but I have owned several before and they're also very reliable pens, especially if you're looking for a German-made pen. So I'm starting to get very tired of my own voice. I do still feel like I threw a lot of information at you, but hopefully this was a very easy to digest guide of fountain pens, and if you have any questions at all, definitely leave them in the comments down below and I or some other fountain pen enthusiast will, I'm sure, happily answer them. Again, I am not a know-it-all with fountain pens. I just truly love the writing experience of fountain pens, and I hope that I have somehow convinced you to try your first one. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!